Welcome back to The Report. In tonight's feature discussion, we look at President Obama's historic visit to Cuba and what it means for the ongoing process of normalising relations between the two countries. Touching down in Havana airport yesterday, he became the first sitting president in 80 years to visit the country. Nathaniel Amos Sansom has this report.
A photo taken just seconds before US Air Force One landed at Havana International Airport seemed to sum up the nature of the historical event. Disembarking from the plane, President Obama and his family were greeted by Cuban and American officials as he became the first sitting president since the 1920s to visit the Caribbean island. He then went on a tour of the historic Old Havana district of the city. He then went on a tour of the historic Old Havana district with his family. The president's first official stop of his three-day visit was a meeting with the staff of the recently reopened US Embassy in the Cuban capital. Addressing the crowd, the president said that the visit would help open a new chapter in US-Cuba relations after decades of animosity.
This is a historic visit, and it's a historic opportunity to engage directly with the Cuban people and to forge new agreements and commercial deals, to build new ties between our two peoples, and for me to lay out my vision for a future that's brighter than our past.
The visit comes after a process lasting several years, aimed at thawing diplomatic relations between the two countries, following decades of mutual antipathy following the 1959 Cuban Revolution. The US president is expected to meet Cuba's Raúl Castro in the coming days, where he is expected to press for economic and democratic reforms while hearing complaints from the Cuban president about continued US economic sanctions. The visit and the wider rapprochement with Cuba has been condemned by senior members of the US Republican Party, who have claimed that the president has conceded too much to the Cuban government without any substantive concessions in return. The visit was also attacked by the Republican presidential frontrunner Donald Trump, who said that Castro's absence from President Obama's landing was a mark of disrespect.
Can you imagine if I were in that position and I landed and nobody was there? They would say, Donald Trump must be incompetent to allow a thing like this to happen. So President Obama landed in Cuba, and the head of Cuba, who was there for the Pope, and he was there for other dignitaries that come in, but he wasn't there for the President of the United States. I mean, we are amateur hour, folks, amateur hour. And honestly, Obama should have turned the plane around and left.
However, the Obama administration has been able to gain some crucial support from the business community in the United States by emphasizing the trade opportunities that re-establishing relations may bring. Peter Hakeem, president of the think tank Inter-American Dialogue, feels that the visit will open up the United States to Cuba and bring more possibilities for trade with the Latin American nation.
President Obama approached this from a conceptual perspective that the way to bring about change in Cuba was not to negotiate it, but to create a new engagement with Cuba, with the notion that this would create an environment in Cuba that would allow and encourage change. The idea was to open up the U.S., remove barriers that the U.S. had placed, and thus creating a more accepting, a more open possibilities for Cuba to take advantage of the U.S. opening.
While major differences remain between the two countries, most notably over issues of one-party rule, the 54-year-old U.S. embargo on the country, and the U.S. presence at Guantanamo Bay, the American president's visit looks set to cement the progress made in recent years. Where that process goes in the future may depend on who is elected as President Obama's successor in November. Nathaniel Amos Sansom, The Report.
Well, joining me to discuss all that is Ollie Hopkins from the Cuba Solidarity Campaign and Jan Halper-Hayes, who's the Vice President of Republicans Abroad UK. Welcome to the programme, both of you. So, communism in Russia disappeared a generation ago. So why didn't this happen earlier? It's no longer an outpost of a kind of hostile empire, as perhaps it was seen rightly or wrongly in the past. So Jan, why not sooner?
Well, American foreign policy is about promoting democracy and advancing security. And Cuba is still ranked Out of 178 nations, 177 just above North Korea, they're still oppressive. They haven't given the people their freedom. They haven't really made changes to democracy.
So on that basis, why has it happened now then?
Because Obama is legacy shopping.
Ollie, why is it taking this long?
It's taken far too long, but we see it as a victory for the Cuban people. It's great that Obama has started the very long process of normalising relations, but yeah, it has taken far too long. But it's a big opportunity. The blockade is still in place. That's the #1 issue affecting Cuban development. So we're hoping that this visit will be the beginning of the end of the blockade, and we really hope Obama will start with concrete action towards normalising relations.
Jan, I mean, if the obstacle has been democracy and human rights, why trade with China? Why trade with Saudi Arabia?
Well, I think that's a very good question, but focusing on Cuba and to my point about him legacy shopping, I think what he's hoping is that the trip is going to be successful enough that it will convince Congress to lift the embargo so trade can happen.
Yeah, but let's go back to the question. If the issue is democracy, the Central Committee of the Chinese Communist Party runs a pretty repressive regime. It executes more people than any other country in the world. But the United States doesn't have a problem with that.
Well, you asked me, why has Cuba been held off? And I said American
And you
foreign
said it was about
policy.
democracy.
Well, I said, and advancing security. But Nixon went over to China to normalize relations, and we have worked together. This is the first time that anyone has thought about opening the door with Cuba.
Ollie, should you be happy? I mean, the contracts are already being signed. The American corporations are already heading over there. What's good about it from your point of view?
Cuba just wants to be a country like any other nation on earth. They want to be able to trade with international companies, with their neighbour. Their neighbour happens to be the United States. They want to have a normal relationship with them. So the blockade has stopped them from developing. It's not just about, whether a Cuban can buy a car because they don't want a 1950s car. It costs lives, the blockade. You're talking chemotherapy drugs. There's people dying because they can't access certain drugs in Cuba. So the blockade is a brutal thing, and the international community is all against it. In the United Nations this year, it was only the United States and Israel out of every 193 nation on earth that is in favour of the blockade. So we want it ended. We want Cuba to be a normal country. We want it to be able to choose its own destiny. It's up to the Cuban people. We want them to trade with who they want to.
But the Cuban Revolution was all about it not being a normal capitalist country, wasn't it? I mean, the Batista regime that the revolution overthrew, rampant mafia involvement, huge American corporations dominating the sugar industry. Why is it good if that comes back?
I certainly don't think that will come back. That was because a US-backed dictator was in charge, but Cuba took its own independence and it's had its own sovereignty since then. It's very good that they got rid of all the stuff that came with Batista, with all the gambling and all the mafia. They all left. Cuba has now built a society based with health and education, some of the best systems on earth. And I have complete faith in the Cuban people and their government to be able to continue to develop whilst having some more trade with the United States. I don't think that they will just suddenly roll over. They've had a lot harder issues than this right now. They've survived the special period in the 1990s, so this is actually, it comes with its threats from the United States, but it is also a huge opportunity for Cuba.
Jan, would a Republican president withdraw? Would they tear up the whole hotel contract that's just been signed in Cuba?
No, they wouldn't. They would tear up the Iran agreement, but no, they wouldn't do that.
So what's your problem then? I mean, if they're going to basically accept it, I mean, okay, I understand politically you have a go at a Democratic president, but substantively,
it's not politically to have a go at a Democratic president. It's that this trip was planned with enormous amount of haste. And that is what makes us wonder, what is the real purpose and what are any of the foundations that needed to have been laid by the advance team going to happen? I mean, actually, having a good relationship with Cuba, we're not against that, and I don't think any Republican is. Lifting the embargo, I think to his point, of course we want things better for the Cuban people, but the regime has to make some of the changes. So they're letting businesses come in. Okay, so that's great for American businesses. But what is going to happen for the Cuban people can only be done by the regime freeing things up. They still don't have freedom of expression. You know, he talks about all the great services. Yes, that's a great infrastructure, but is the Cuban government going to give back the homes and businesses that they took from people?
Maybe there'll be health tourism. Do you think, Ollie? Cuba has one of the best health systems in the world. Do you think Americans, who even with Obamacare don't, will be coming to Cuba for healthcare?
I think there's probably 50, 60 million Americans that would give anything on earth to have a health system like Cuba's. You know, it is a beacon for the developing world. They don't only just look after their own people, they have 50,000 health workers throughout the world. You know, they were the first after the Kashmir earthquake, in the Nepali earthquake. They even offered after the New Orleans Hurricane Katrina. They help the world. They've got the Latin America School of Medicine, which has trained thousands of doctors. So I think Americans would love to have anything like what Cuba have with their healthcare.
I mean, that's true, isn't it, Jan? I mean, you know, you can make some headway with the political criticisms about the democratic setup, but you're not going to make much headway telling Cubans that they'd be better off if they look like American workers.
So your question is?
That there's that if you look at all the health indices, if you look at the longevity of Cubans, if you look at a number of social indicators, they're ahead of where lots of Americans are.
That's true. And in fact, our economy is so bad that now it's the middle-class white male that is dying earlier than anyone else. I could possibly see that people might decide to go and retire in Cuba, partially for the health care that's there.
The new Florida?
Well, as I think Marco Rubio, one of the Republican candidates, well, former candidates, was saying, there is this flow of people going to the United States and then travelling back to Cuba 10, 12 times a year. And his words were, they wouldn't do this if it was this, you know, bad regime that everyone talks about. They're going there, they're seeing their family, they're going in and out of American Cuba. And I think the future is going to be family relations, improved state relations, and a lot more flow between the two countries.
Well, I think that actually is a very positive outcome, because before they couldn't, and so there wasn't that connection.
It is, yeah, and we hope that Americans can travel freely to Cuba as well, because Cuba have always welcomed anyone. It's the American government that stopped US tourism to Cuba, so.
Let's talk about what this might lead to. Might it, for instance, I mean, it's a pretty weird anomaly in any case that the American state has a prison on somebody else's country. It wouldn't go down well if it happened here. The French kind of put up with it with the refugees that are coming to Britain in France, but it's unusual. Do you think Guantanamo Bay is likely to be pushed out of Cuba before anybody gets around to closing it?
No.
Why not?
Because when we didn't have open relations, it was fine that it was there, and it was fine that we were storing all the terrorists there.
What's the thing with the Cuban regime? Why does it put up with that?
We certainly hope that Guantanamo Bay will be returned to Cuba. It's the only US military base on Earth that is not wanted by the host government. It's kind of a well-known thing that the Americans send a check every year. The Cubans don't cash it. We want the torture camp closed. Nobody likes the torture, the human rights abuses that happen on the island in Guantanamo Bay. But we also want to see the land returned to Cuba because it's their land.
Mm. So anything else that you think might come out of this, or is this just kind of as good as it's going to get, Jan?
Well, again, you have to think about what is the purpose of the trip. I mean, who's going to benefit? Are the U.S. people going to benefit? Are the Cuban people going to benefit? How's the Cuban government benefiting? And if it is to open trade relations, then Obama has to convince our Congress that they need to lift the embargo and show why. I think it's not going to happen in Obama's reign because there have been too many failures in all of his foreign policy
some
efforts.
Of the business community are already convinced because contracts are already being signed, aren't
well,
they?
It's the same with Iran. You know, I mean, there are smart business people that are willing to jump in and take the risks. But the bottom line is, if Congress doesn't lift the embargo, then life is not going to get better in terms of the relationship of trade that we could do with the Cuban people.
Okay, so this is novel. So Jan's arguing for a more regulated economy, and you're going to get a less regulated one.
Well, if anything comes out of this, if the blockade was to be ended, that would be a huge victory for Cuba, and it would benefit the Cuban people and the American people.
Do you think it will happen?
Do I think it will end? I certainly hope it will end.
Yeah,
I know.
do you think it will?
I know
I
there's.
mean,
I know
we
there's a
all
long
hope it
way
will,
to go. We all know the situation that's happening in Republican-controlled Congress. You know, they're a very hard bunch to convince. But I really do hope that there's lots of business interests there, there's health interests. You know, you look at the Cuba vaccine for lung cancer that they're developing at the moment, I'm sure that there's millions of Americans that would love to have access to the Cuban-led health research, and the blockade will benefit both countries.
Okay, Jan Halper-Hayes, Ollie Hopkins, thanks very much for that discussion, but I'm afraid it's all we've got time for on this episode of The Report. I want to thank all my guests on today's show and to thank you for taking the time to watch. Now, remember, you can keep up with us on Twitter by following @IslamChannelCA and by using the hashtag #TheReport. But for now, we'll leave you with scenes from Mexico, where visitors and locals flock to the 2,000-year-old Pyramid of the Sun, raising their hands to greet the sun during the spring equinox celebrations. Well, we'll be rising with the sun tomorrow for another episode of The Report, but until then, good night.